An 80-year-old woman bought a plot of land, but businessman tried to buy it back for double. The offer came Tuesday morning with the kind of desperation that made no sense. Harrison Blackstone stood on Magnolia Clearwater's porch, sweat beading despite the cool Wyoming air, clutching papers that trembled in his manicured hands. Behind him, a black SUV idled with tinted windows, and through the passenger side, she glimpsed another man speaking rapidly into a phone. The businessman's eyes darted to the bare ground where she had planned to plant her vegetable garden, then to the old well cover her late husband had installed decades ago. When Magnolia asked why he wanted to pay double for land she had purchased just 3 weeks prior, Harrison's rehearsed smile faltered, and he mentioned something about water rights and corporate interests that sounded like a foreign language. The strangest part was not his desperate offer, but the way he kept glancing at his watch, as if time was running out for something far more important than a simple real estate transaction. 3 weeks earlier, Magnolia had used her teacher's pension savings to purchase the 40-acre plot outside Casper, Wyoming, dreaming of a quiet place to spend her remaining years close to where her daughter June practiced law. The land seemed unremarkable, rolling hills dotted with sagebrush and a small creek that ran along the southern border, but it spoke to something deep in her heart about independence and starting fresh after Harold's death. She had paid fair market value according to the county assessor, and the previous owner, an elderly rancher named Pete Morrison, had seemed eager to sell quickly due to medical bills that were draining his savings. The property came with an old farmhouse that needed work, a barn that leaned precariously to one side, and mineral rights that the realtor had mentioned in passing but dismissed as worthless in this particular area. Magnolia had spent the past 3 weeks cleaning out the house, replacing broken windows, and planning where to build the chicken coop she had always wanted but never had space for in town. Now, Harrison Blackstone stood before her, offering twice what she had paid, his expensive suit contrasting sharply with her practical work clothes and dirt-stained hands. He represented Pinnacle Development Corporation, a name that meant nothing to her, and spoke in carefully measured tones about immediate cash payments and no-hassle transactions that could be completed within 48 hours. When she asked what Pinnacle intended to do with the land, his answer came too quickly and too rehearsed. Something about agricultural development and sustainable farming initiatives that sounded impressive but felt hollow. The way his eyes kept returning to the old well cover made her stomach tighten with unease, and when she politely declined his offer, the relief that flickered across his face was quickly replaced by something that looked remarkably like panic. The panic in Harrison Blackstone's eyes haunted Magnolia through the sleepless night that followed his visit. She sat at her kitchen table with her laptop, the blue glow illuminating her weathered hands as she searched for information about Pinnacle Development Corporation. What she found made her blood run cold. The company specialized in large-scale water extraction projects across the western United States, with a track record of purchasing rural properties for mineral and water rights, then selling the stripped land to municipalities for development. Their website featured glossy photos of massive industrial pumping stations and corporate executives shaking hands with government officials. But the recent news articles told a different story of small communities losing their water sources and family farms withering after Pinnacle moved in. The most disturbing discovery was a pending lawsuit in Colorado where Pinnacle had allegedly used shell companies to purchase land from elderly owners at below-market prices, only to reveal later that the properties sat atop one of the largest freshwater aquifers in the region. By sunrise, Magnolia's hands were shaking as she dialed her daughter's number in Casper. June Clearwater had built her legal practice defending small ranchers against corporate land grabs, and her voice carried the sharp edge of someone who had seen this playbook before. According to June, companies like Pinnacle rarely made unsolicited offers, unless they had insider information about valuable resources. And the fact that they were offering double market value suggested they knew something that was not public record. June promised to research the property's geological surveys and water rights documentation, but warned her mother that if Pinnacle was involved, this situation would escalate quickly and potentially turn dangerous. The conversation was interrupted by the rumble of diesel engines outside, and through her window, Magnolia watched 3 white pickup trucks with Pinnacle Development logos park along the fence line of her property. Men in hard hats and orange safety vests emerged from the trucks carrying surveying equipment, digital tablets, and what appeared to be soil testing devices. They worked methodically along her southern border where the creek ran, taking measurements and photographs, while carefully staying just outside her property line on the adjacent public easement. When Magnolia stepped onto her porch to observe them, One of the workers immediately pulled out his phone and made a call, speaking in urgent tones while gesturing toward her house. The crew worked for 3 hours, paying particular attention to the area around her old well and the natural depression where Harold had always said the ground stayed wet even during drought years. As they packed up their equipment, the crew leader walked to her fence line and called out that they were conducting routine environmental assessments for the county, but his explanation felt as rehearsed as Harrison's had the day before. Something about their presence and their intense focus on her water sources made Magnolia realize that her quiet retirement plan had just become the center of a battle she did not understand, but would have to fight. June Clearwater arrived at sunset in her mud-splattered pickup truck, her briefcase in one hand and a stack of legal documents in the other, her expression grim in a way that made Magnolia's stomach tighten with dread. As a water rights attorney, June had spent the afternoon at the county courthouse pulling records, and what she discovered explained everything about Pinnacle's desperate interest in the property. The land sat directly above the Casper Aquifer's primary recharge zone, where underground streams from the Rocky Mountain snowpack fed into one of Wyoming's most valuable freshwater reserves. More importantly, the previous owner, Pete Morrison, had unknowingly sold Magnolia a property with senior water rights dating back to 1892. Making her legally entitled to unlimited groundwater extraction that could support municipal water systems for hundreds of thousands of people. According to geological surveys filed just 6 months ago, Pinnacle Development had already secured contracts with 3 major municipalities to supply water for rapidly growing populations, but their entire operation depended on accessing the recharge zone that now belonged to an 80-year-old woman who had bought it with her teacher's pension. The conversation was interrupted by headlights turning into their driveway, and Harrison Blackstone emerged from his black SUV, accompanied by a woman in an expensive suit, who introduced herself as Sarah Chen, Pinnacle's regional legal counsel. Chen carried a leather portfolio that she opened with practiced efficiency, revealing a new purchase offer that made both women gasp. The figure was not double the original price, but 5 times what Magnolia had paid, along with a proposal for lifetime residence rights that would allow her to stay on the property until her death, while Pinnacle developed the water resources underneath. Chen's presentation was polished and professional, complete with colorful charts showing projected water shortages across the western United States, and Pinnacle's role in solving the crisis through responsible aquifer management. When June asked pointed questions about environmental impact studies and community water access, Chen's answers became evasive, and Harrison's nervous energy suggested that their generous offer came with a deadline that was approaching faster than they were comfortable admitting. The meeting took an ominous turn when Chen casually mentioned that elderly landowners sometimes faced unexpected challenges maintaining their properties, from tax assessments to code enforcement issues that could make rural living difficult for someone of Magnolia's age. The implied threat was delivered with a smile, but June's expression hardened as she recognized the tactics that powerful corporations used to pressure vulnerable property owners into selling. Chen left behind a thick packet of legal documents that would need to be signed within 72 hours, along with her business card and a warning that this level of generosity was typically a one-time offer that would not be repeated. As their SUV disappeared into the darkness, Magnolia and June stood in the kitchen examining the paperwork, both women realizing that they were no longer dealing with a simple business transaction, but a corporate campaign designed to separate an old woman from the most valuable piece of land she would ever own. The question was no longer whether Pinnacle would try to take the property, but how far they would go to get it, and whether a retired teacher and her daughter could mount a defense against one of the most powerful development corporations in the western United States. The 72-hour deadline arrived with a storm of harassment that began at dawn and never stopped. Magnolia's landline phone rang every 30 minutes with calls from different Pinnacle representatives, each offering slight variations on their final offer, while emphasizing the limited time remaining to accept their generous terms. When she stopped answering the phone, they switched to her cell number, which she had never given them, and the realization that they had somehow obtained her private information sent ice through her veins. By mid-morning, a steady stream of visitors began arriving at her door, from county assessors claiming they needed to reevaluate her property taxes to building inspectors who insisted on examining her electrical systems and septic tank for code violations. Each official carried legitimate credentials and spoke with authority. but their timing and coordination felt orchestrated in a way that made June suspicious about who was really pulling the strings behind these sudden bureaucratic concerns. The psychological pressure intensified when June discovered that someone had been researching their family background with disturbing thoroughness. Her law office received calls from reporters asking about her mother's land purchase and whether the elderly woman understood the environmental implications of blocking municipal water development projects. The questions were loaded with assumptions that painted Magnolia as a selfish obstacle to community progress, and June realized that Pinnacle was already crafting a public relations narrative that would justify whatever legal action they were planning to take next. More troubling were the anonymous tips called into various regulatory agencies, claiming that an elderly woman was improperly managing hazardous materials and livestock on her rural property, triggering visits from environmental inspectors and animal control officers, who found nothing wrong but created a paper trail of complaints that could be used against her later. The breaking point came when June returned from Casper to find her mother sitting on the porch steps, her hands shaking as she held a legal document that had been hand-delivered while June was away. The papers were from a shell company called Wyoming Water Solutions, claiming that Pete Morrison had never had the legal right to sell water access to the property, and that Magnolia's purchase was invalid due to fraudulent misrepresentation of mineral rights. The lawsuit demanded immediate vacation of the property and financial damages for interfering with legitimate water development contracts. But what frightened Magnolia most was the cover letter's suggestion that elderly property owners who fought corporate development often found themselves facing personal injury lawsuits when their deteriorating properties became safety hazards. June examined the legal filing with growing anger, recognizing the tactics of a company that had researched every possible avenue to separate her mother from her land, including manufactured legal challenges that would cost thousands to defend, even when they were completely without merit. As darkness fell, mother and daughter sat at the kitchen table surrounded by legal documents, county records, and geological surveys, both women understanding that they were fighting a battle that went far beyond property rights or water access. Pinnacle Development Corporation had turned Magnolia's simple retirement dream into a corporate war zone where an 80-year-old woman's right to own land was being challenged by lawyers, bureaucrats, and public relations specialists who had unlimited resources and no moral boundaries. The question was no longer whether they could win this fight, but whether they could survive it long enough to expose the corruption that was hidden beneath Pinnacle's professional facade. June's investigation into Pinnacle's local connections revealed a web of corruption that explained how the corporation had moved so quickly and decisively against her mother. 3 county commissioners had approved fast-track permits for Pinnacle's water extraction projects without public hearings, and their campaign finance records showed substantial donations from Wyoming Water Solutions, the same shell company now suing Magnolia for fraudulent land ownership. The county assessor, who had suddenly appeared to reevaluate Magnolia's property taxes, was married to Pinnacle's regional operations manager, and the building inspector demanding code compliance had received a consulting contract from the corporation just 2 months after taking his government position. Most damaging was June's discovery that the county judge assigned to hear Wyoming Water Solutions' lawsuit against her mother was the former law partner of Sarah Chen, a conflict of interest that should have required his immediate recusal from the case. The corruption ran deeper when June learned that Pinnacle had been systematically targeting elderly landowners across the region using identical tactics. A retired schoolteacher in Laramie had sold her family ranch after facing similar bureaucratic harassment and manufactured legal challenges, only to discover later that her property sat above another crucial aquifer recharge zone. An elderly widower in Cheyenne had died of a heart attack 3 weeks after Pinnacle initiated legal proceedings against him, and his children had sold the contested property for a fraction of its value to avoid prolonged court battles they could not afford. The pattern was unmistakable. Pinnacle identified vulnerable property owners with valuable water rights, then used coordinated pressure campaigns involving corrupt local officials to force quick sales at below-market prices. The situation escalated when Magnolia discovered that someone had tampered with her property during the night. Her fence posts along the southern border had been deliberately weakened, creating the appearance of property line disputes that could support trespassing claims, and her old well cover had been pried open and left exposed, creating a safety hazard that could trigger liability issues if anyone were injured. More troubling was evidence that someone had been testing her water supply. with small holes drilled into her irrigation pipes and sediment samples taken from her creek without permission. The vandalism was subtle, but professional, designed to create legal problems while appearing accidental to anyone who was not looking carefully for signs of sabotage. The psychological warfare reached a new level when Harrison Blackstone returned with a final offer that revealed the true desperation driving Pinnacle's campaign. The corporation was prepared to pay 10 times Magnolia's original purchase price, but only if she signed the transfer documents within 24 hours and agreed to never discuss the sale publicly. Harrison's hands shook as he explained that municipal water contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars were scheduled to begin pumping operations within 60 days, and any delay would trigger penalty clauses that could bankrupt the company's regional operations. His desperation was so complete that he actually pleaded with her to consider the jobs that would be lost and the communities that would suffer if she continued to block their access to the water that flowed beneath her property. As Harrison drove away after her final refusal, Magnolia and June watched his SUV disappear into the darkness, both women knowing that they had just crossed a line from which there would be no return. Pinnacle Development Corporation had invested too much money and political capital to accept defeat from an 80-year-old woman, and their next move would likely abandon any pretense of legal or ethical behavior. The question was whether Magnolia had the strength and June had the skill to survive whatever desperate measures a cornered corporation might use to claim the water that could make or break their entire business empire. The retaliation came at 3 in the morning when Magnolia's security lights triggered motion alarms that sent her stumbling from bed in her nightgown. Through her bedroom window, she watched a crew of men in dark clothing systematically destroying her property with professional efficiency that spoke of corporate planning rather than random vandalism. They cut her fence wire in precise sections that would require expensive repairs, punctured holes in her irrigation pipes that would flood her fields, and used sledgehammers to damage her well pump in ways that would contaminate her water supply and create immediate health code violations. Most disturbing was their methodical approach to documenting the damage with digital cameras, as if they were creating evidence for insurance claims or legal proceedings that had already been planned before the sabotage began. When Magnolia called the sheriff's office, the dispatcher informed her that deputies were responding to multiple emergency calls across the county and would not be available until morning, a response that felt too convenient to be coincidental. June arrived within an hour of her mother's frantic phone call, her pickup truck headlights illuminating the systematic destruction that had transformed Magnolia's peaceful property into a disaster zone designed to force immediate evacuation. The damage was extensive enough to trigger county health and safety inspections that could condemn the property as uninhabitable, but subtle enough that proving corporate sabotage would require expensive forensic investigations that most elderly property owners could not afford. By dawn, they understood that Pinnacle Development Corporation had abandoned any pretense of legal acquisition and moved into the phase of their operation that destroyed property owners through financial exhaustion and bureaucratic harassment. The psychological warfare escalated when June discovered that someone had filed anonymous complaints with the state environmental agency claiming that Magnolia was illegally dumping chemicals into the groundwater that fed municipal water supplies. The accusations were specific enough to trigger immediate regulatory inspections, but false enough that disproving them would require extensive soil and water testing that could cost thousands of dollars and take weeks to complete. More troubling was the coordinated media campaign that began appearing on local news websites, featuring anonymous quotes from concerned citizens who worried that elderly property owners were blocking essential water development projects that could prevent drought emergencies in growing communities. The articles never mentioned Magnolia by name, but their descriptions of her situation were detailed enough that neighbors and local businesses began treating her with suspicion and hostility. The turning point came when June received a phone call from an investigative journalist in Denver who had been tracking Pinnacle's land acquisition patterns across multiple states. Reporter Maria Santos had documented dozens of cases where the corporation used identical tactics against elderly property owners, and she was building a federal investigation into their systematic corruption of local government officials and fraudulent environmental claims. Santos explained that Pinnacle's water extraction contracts contained penalty clauses so severe that missing their 60-day deadline would bankrupt the regional operation and potentially trigger criminal investigations into their bribing of county officials. The corporation was fighting for its survival, not just profit margins, which explained why they had escalated to property destruction and character assassination against an 80-year-old woman whose only crime was owning land above the most valuable water source in Wyoming. For the first time since this nightmare began, Magnolia and June realized they were not fighting alone, and that exposing Pinnacle's corruption could protect other families from the same corporate predators who had turned their quiet retirement into a battlefield. Working with investigative journalist Maria Santos transformed Magnolia and June from isolated victims into key witnesses in a federal investigation that could expose Pinnacle's systematic corruption across the western United States. Santos had documented evidence that the corporation used shell companies to hide their true ownership of local government officials, and her research revealed bank records showing direct payments to county commissioners, judges, and regulatory inspectors who had facilitated their illegal land acquisitions. Most damaging was Santos's discovery that Pinnacle had been falsifying geological surveys and environmental impact studies to hide the true value of properties they targeted, a pattern of fraud that violated federal water rights laws and could trigger criminal prosecution of their executive leadership. The investigation required Magnolia to provide detailed documentation of every threat, offer, and act of sabotage she had experienced, transforming her nightmare into evidence that could protect hundreds of other families from similar corporate predators. The cooperation with federal investigators triggered an immediate escalation in Pinnacle's desperation that revealed the true extent of their criminal enterprise. Sarah Chen arrived at Magnolia's property, accompanied by two men who introduced themselves as private security consultants, their presence designed to intimidate an elderly woman into accepting a settlement that would prevent her testimony from reaching federal prosecutors. Chen's final offer was not just money, but a comprehensive package that included relocation assistance, medical insurance, and financial support for June's law practice, all contingent on signing non-disclosure agreements that would prevent them from discussing Pinnacle's activities with journalists, investigators, or other potential victims. The presentation was polished and professional, but the underlying threat was unmistakable. Accept our generous terms, or face the consequences of opposing a corporation that had unlimited resources and no moral boundaries in protecting their business interests. When Magnolia refused to sign the non-disclosure agreement, Chen's mask of corporate professionalism finally slipped to reveal the desperation that had been driving their campaign from the beginning. The water extraction contracts were not just business deals, but legally binding commitments to municipal governments that were facing severe drought conditions and growing populations that demanded immediate solutions to their water supply problems. Pinnacle had promised delivery dates that assumed easy acquisition of Magnolia's property, and their failure to meet those deadlines would trigger penalty payments that exceeded the corporation's regional assets and could force them into bankruptcy proceedings that would expose decades of fraudulent business practices. Chen's admission that they faced criminal prosecution and financial ruin if they could not access Magnolia's water source within the next 2 weeks revealed that an 80-year-old woman's stubborn refusal to sell had accidentally cornered one of the most powerful development corporations in the United States. The realization that she held the power to destroy Pinnacle Development Corporation filled Magnolia with a mixture of terror and determination that reminded her of the moment she had decided to buy the property, despite her daughter's concerns about the financial risk. Standing on her porch as Chen's security consultants loaded their intimidation materials back into their black SUV, Magnolia understood that this fight had evolved beyond property rights or water access into a test of whether ordinary citizens could resist corporate corruption that threatened the foundation of democratic society. Tomorrow would bring the final confrontation that would determine not just the fate of her land, but the message that would be sent to every other corporation that believed elderly property owners were easy targets for systematic theft disguised as business development. The final confrontation arrived with federal marshals who surrounded Pinnacle Development Corporation's regional headquarters at dawn, armed with warrants that Maria Santos's investigation had provided to prosecutors who specialized in corporate fraud and public corruption. Magnolia watched the live news coverage from her kitchen table, her hands steady for the first time in weeks as she witnessed Harrison Blackstone and Sarah Chen being led away in handcuffs, while investigators seized computers, financial records, and communication devices that contained evidence of their systematic bribery of local officials. The federal charges included wire fraud, conspiracy to violate water rights laws, and racketeering activities that carried prison sentences severe enough to end their careers and destroy the corporation's ability to operate in the western United States. The collapse of Pinnacle's criminal enterprise triggered a cascade of revelations that vindicated every suspicion Magnolia and June had developed during their weeks of harassment and intimidation. County Judge Morrison recused himself from all pending cases and announced his resignation after prosecutors